The sun dipped low over Santa Barbara, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold as Nick stood in the honeymoon suite, leaning against the doorframe. His eyes followed Sophie, her dark hair catching the soft glow of the lamps as she unpacked her suitcase with that familiar smile, the one that had hooked him 3 years ago when they met at a beach bonfire. At 28, Nick felt like the luckiest man alive. Just a week ago, they'd tied the knot under a canopy of stars, fairy lights twinkling above as they swayed to their first dance. The wedding wasn't lavish, simple, intimate with maybe 50 guests, but it was theirs, perfect in its imperfections, like the slightly crooked cake they'd laughed about cutting. Sophie's parents, Thomas and Ellen, had been all over the planning. Ellen picked every flower, fussing over peonies versus roses, while Thomas insisted on the table settings, right down to the napkin's folds. Nick didn't mind. He wasn't one for details. He just wanted Sophie happy. And she was radiant in her white dress, her eyes locked on his as they whispered vows under the moonlight. That night, as they danced, he thought, this is it, the start of forever. But forever felt fragile now. 5 days later, as Sophie sat on the edge of the bed, her phone buzzing with a text from her mom. Nick watched her read it, her smile fading just a touch. "What's up?" he asked, keeping his tone light, though something in his gut tightened. She looked up, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Mom and Dad wanted to go on a family trip. Just the 3 of us to Palm Springs. Some bonding thing, I guess." Her voice was casual, but her eyes searched his like she was waiting for permission. Nick's stomach twisted. A family trip? Now, they hadn't even planned their own honeymoon yet, still debating between a cabin in Big Sur or a week in Hawaii. He crossed his arms, leaning back against the wall. "Kinda sudden, don't you think? We just got married." Sophie stood, stepping closer, her hand finding his. I know. It's only 4 days, Nick. I'll be back before you blink." She flashed that smile again, the one that always melted him. "They're just excited, you know? They're only kids married now. They probably want one last. I don't know, family moment." He wanted to say no. The words sat heavy on his tongue, sharp and ready. But he didn't. Nick wasn't that guy, the jealous husband who clipped his wife's wings. He'd seen what control did to relationships. His cousin's marriage imploded over less. So he swallowed the unease, forcing a grin. "All right, go have your desert adventure. But you owe me a beach day when you're back." Her face lit up, and she threw her arms around him, her laughter warm against his chest. "Deal. You're the best." For a moment, everything felt right again. Just a quick trip, nothing to worry about. But the next morning, as Nick drove her to the airport, that knot in his gut grew. Thomas and Ellen were waiting at the curb, their SUV packed with luggage. Ellen's smile was tight, more polite than warm, like she was posing for a photo she didn't want taken. Thomas barely looked at Nick, just nodded, his face blank as he loaded Sophie's bag. "Take care of her," Nick said, his voice steady but firm, holding Thomas's gaze for a second longer than needed. "Of course," Thomas replied, already turning away. Sophie kissed Nick quick, her lips soft but rushed. "Miss you already," she whispered, then hurried to join her parents. Nick watched her go, her ponytail bouncing as she walked through the terminal doors. The SUV pulled away, and he stood there, alone, the hum of the airport fading into a quiet that felt too heavy. Back home, the house was too still without her. No clatter of her making coffee, no humming as she scrolled through her phone. Nick sank onto the couch, staring at the spot where Sophie usually curled up with a book. It's just 4 days, he told himself. But the unease lingered, sharp and nagging, like a splinter he couldn't reach. Why now? Why so soon after the wedding? He grabbed his phone, typing a quick text. "Miss you. Have fun out there." He added a heart emoji, hoping it'd mask the doubt creeping in. Her reply came hours later, a simple, "Miss you too." It should have calmed him, but it didn't. Something about it fell off, like a note played just out of tune. Nick set the phone down, his eyes drifting to the wedding photo on the mantel, Sophie laughing, him grinning like a fool. He wanted to believe in that moment, in her in them. But as he sat in the silent house, the first crack in their forever began to form, invisible but deep, waiting to split everything apart. Nick sat on the couch, the Santa Barbara house swallowed by silence that felt louder than it should. It was the second night without Sophie, and the emptiness gnawed at him. Her coffee mug sat unwashed on the counter, a faint lipstick stain on the rim, and her favorite throw blanket lay crumpled where she'd left it. At 28, Nick was used to being alone. He'd lived solo before they met, but this was different. This wasn't just her absence. It was the weight of something unspoken, something wrong. He glanced at his phone again, the screen dark. No new text since her brief "miss you too" yesterday. He'd sent another message this morning, "How's Palm Springs?" But hours later, nothing. He stood, pacing the living room, the hardwood creaking under his steps. The wedding photo on the mantel caught his eye. Sophie smiled wide, his arm around her waist. He wanted to shake off the unease, to trust her like he always had. But the memory of Thomas's blank nod at the airport, Ellen's tight smile, kept replaying. Why the rush? Why take her away so soon after the vows? Nick rubbed his jaw, trying to quiet the questions, but they only grew louder. Then his phone buzzed, a faint vibration against the coffee table. He grabbed it, heart jumping, expecting Sophie's name. It was her, a photo. She stood by a glittering pool, sunglasses perched on her nose, her smile bright against the desert sun. Having fun, she'd written. Nick's shoulders relaxed for a split second, a grin tugging at his lips. She looked happy, like the Sophie he knew. But then his eyes drifted to the background. A man stood near the pool's edge, maybe 10 feet behind her. Tall, tan, in a crisp white shirt, his smirk sharp enough to cut glass. He was looking at Sophie, not the camera, his gaze too familiar, too close. Nick's stomach churned. He zoomed in, the pixelated image sharpening just enough to confirm it wasn't Thomas. This guy was younger, richer looking, the kind who wore confidence like a tailored suit. Who the hell was he? Nick's thumb hovered over the reply button, but he stopped. Asking who's that would sound paranoid. Instead, he saved the photo and opened his contacts, scrolling to Ryan, his old college buddy turned private investigator in Palm Springs. Ryan owed him a favor after Nick helped him move last summer. If anyone could dig into this, it was him. "Hey, man," Nick said when Ryan picked up, keeping his voice steady. "Need a favor. Sophie's in Palm Springs with her parents. Something feels off. Can you keep an eye on them? Maybe see who they're with." Ryan didn't hesitate. "Yeah, I got you. Anything specific I should look for?" Nick paused, the photo burning in his mind. "Just anyone else hanging around. Especially if it's not family." "I don't know, Ree. It's probably nothing, but I need to be sure." "Say no more," Ryan replied. "I'll poke around, get you something by tomorrow. Hang tight." Nick thanked him and hung up, the knot in his chest loosening just a fraction. If it was nothing, he'd laugh it off. If it wasn't, he'd deal with that later. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Nick tossed in their too-big bed, the sheets cold without Sophie's warmth. By morning, his phone was silent, no text from her, no calls. He brewed coffee, the bitter smell filling the kitchen, and tried to focus on work emails. But his mind kept drifting to that photo, to the stranger's smirk. When his phone finally pinged at noon, he nearly dropped his mug. It was Ryan, with a single line, "Check your email. You're going to want to see this." Nick's pulse raced as he opened his laptop. Ryan's email held a zipped folder labeled Palm Springs. He clicked, and a flood of files spilled out. Photos, a short video, even scanned receipts. The first image hit like a punch. Sophie at a sleek restaurant, laughing across a candlelit table from the same guy from the pool. Jake, Ryan's notes called him, son of some big-shot investor. Jake leaned close, his hand brushing hers as he passed a drink. Sophie didn't pull away. Thomas and Ellen sat nearby, smiling like proud parents at a school play. Nick's jaw tightened, his breath shallow. He clicked the video next. The footage was grainy, shot from a distance, but the audio was clear. Ellen's voice, low and coaxing. "Jake's perfect, isn't he? So much potential." Sophie's laugh followed, light and real, the one Nick hadn't heard in days. The clip ended with Jake's arm around her shoulder, her head tilting toward him. Nick slammed the laptop shut, his hand shaking. This wasn't a family trip. It was a setup, and Sophie was playing along, whether she knew it or not. He stood, pacing again, the room closing in. The receipts showed they were all at the same ritzy hotel, Jake's suite just floors above Sophie's. Dinners, drinks, a beach walk. Every moment documented, every smile a knife in Nick's chest. He wanted to call her, to demand answers, but he stopped himself. Rage wouldn't help. He needed a plan, something sharp and deliberate. Nick reopened the laptop, saving every file. Whatever this was, he wasn't letting it stay in the shadows. Sophie was his wife, and no one, not Jake, not her parents, was going to steal that without a fight. Nick stood in the kitchen, the scent of burnt toast lingering as he stared at the folder on the counter. It wasn't a physical folder. Not yet, but the digital one Ryan had sent, now printed and neatly stacked, felt heavier than it should. Photos, receipts, a transcript of that damning video where Ellen whispered, "Jake's perfect, isn't he?" Each page was a shard of proof that Sophie's family trip to Palm Springs was a betrayal orchestrated by her parents, with Jake as their smug pawn. Nick, 28, hadn't slept properly in days, the silence of their Santa Barbara home deafening without Sophie's laughter. But today, she was back, and the air between them crackled with something unspoken. Sophie sat at the dining table, her hair messy from sleep, wearing one of Nick's old t-shirts. She poked at her pancakes, her fork scraping the plate, her eyes avoiding his. Last night, when Nick picked her up from the airport, he'd expected her to leap into his arms, like she used to. Instead, she'd given a tired smile, a quick hug, and spent the drive home staring out the window. He'd asked about the trip. She'd mumbled, "Fine, just relaxing," without looking at him. Now, her silence screamed louder than any words could. Nick cleared his throat, leaning against the counter, his coffee mug warm in his hand. "So how was it? Get that tan you wanted?" His tone was light, but his pulse thrummed with anticipation. Sophie shrugged, still staring at her plate. "Yes, some of that." Her voice was flat, lifeless, nothing like the bubbly Sophie who'd left for Palm Springs 4 days ago. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until she set her fork down and met his gaze. Her eyes were different, distant, like a wall had gone up. "Nick," she said, barely audible, maybe we need a break." The words hit like a slap, but Nick didn't flinch. His chest tightened, a slow burn of anger and hurt, but he kept his face calm, almost too calm. A break? They'd been married less than 2 weeks. He took a slow sip of coffee, letting the bitterness mirror the moment. "A break," he repeated, setting the mug down with a soft clink. "That's funny." He reached for the printed folder, its edges crisp, and slid it across the table. "Because I got some info on that trip of yours." Sophie's brow furrowed, her fingers hesitating before pulling the folder closer. She opened it, her breath catching as she scanned the first page. Names, dates, a summary Ryan had typed up. Then she flipped to the photos, and her hands froze. There she was by the pool, Jake's arm slung around her shoulder. Another at a restaurant, his hand brushing hers over a glass of wine. A beach walk, her laughing as he leaned close. Her eyes widened, darting over each image, her fingers trembling. "Nick, what is this?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Before he could answer, the front door creaked open. Nick didn't turn. He'd heard the car pull up, the footsteps on the porch. Thomas and Ellen stepped inside, casual as if they'd just stopped by for brunch. Ellen carried a leather-bound album. Wedding photos, no doubt, her smile bright but brittle. "Hope we're not interrupting," she chirped, setting the album on the counter. Thomas nodded at Nick, his face as blank as ever, like he was bored by the tension in the room. Sophie's head snapped up, her gaze locking on her parents, then back to the folder. Nick leaned back, arms crossed, letting the moment hang. He'd planned this, not the exact timing, but close enough. Yesterday, while Sophie slept off her jet lag, he'd sent texts to friends, cousins, and a few key players. Ryan, Kate, even Thomas and Ellen. Evening of memories at the wedding venue. One last look at the big day. 6 p.m. They'd all RSVP'd, Ellen with a cheery house suite. "We'll be there." Sophie had texted back, "Is this necessary?" He'd replied, "Yeah. It's time people knew." Now, as Sophie stared at the photos, her hands shaking so hard a page slipped to the floor, Nick felt the weight of his plan settle. "I didn't know," she said, her voice desperate, eyes pleading with him. "Nick, I swear, I didn't know they were planning anything." He raised an eyebrow, his voice low. "Didn't know what, Soph? That your parents were parading you around with some rich guy, like I didn't exist." Her mouth opened, but no words came. Ellen stepped forward, her smile faltering. "Now, Nick, let's not overreact. It was just a friendly trip." Nick laughed, short and bitter. "Friendly, right?" He glanced at Sophie, her face pale, then at Thomas, who hadn't said a word. "You'll all get a chance to explain tonight. At the venue. Everyone's coming." Sophie's eyes widened, panic flickering. Ellen's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. Thomas just checked his phone, like this was all beneath him. Nick picked up his coffee, taking another sip, the mug hiding the storm in his chest. Sophie wanted a break? Fine. But she, her parents, and their little scheme were about to face the light. He'd set the trap, and by tonight, the truth would be out, raw and undeniable for everyone to see. The wedding venue in Santa Barbara buzzed with tension, the fairy lights from Nick and Sophie's big day still strung across the wooden beams, now casting a harsh glow over the gathered crowd. Nick, 28, stood at the front. The projectors hummed, the only sound as 20 pairs of eyes, friends, cousins, Ryan and Kate, stared at the wall. The final slide lingered. Sophie laughing with Jake by the Palm Springs pool, his arm around her, Thomas and Ellen grinning in the background. Then the video played, Ellen's voice slicing through the silence. Jake's perfect, isn't he? The room froze, a collective gasp sucking the air out. Nick clicked the projector off, crossing his arms. That's what they've been up to while I was here, thinking I had a wife. Sophie shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly, her face flushed with panic. I didn't know, she shouted, her voice breaking. Nick, I swear I didn't plan this. Her eyes, wet and wide, begged him to believe her, but Nick's gaze was steady, unmoved. Maybe not, he said, his voice low, cutting like a blade. But you didn't stop it, Sophie. You laughed, you smiled, you let him in. She sank back in her chair, hands covering her face, sobs muffled but sharp. Ellen jumped up, her pearls glinting as she pointed at Nick. This is ridiculous, she snapped, her composure cracking. You're blowing a friendly trip out of proportion. Jake, sitting near the back, nodded, his smug grin fading but still clinging to confidence. Yeah, man, chill, he said, leaning back. It's not like we. Shut it. Nick cut him off, his voice sharp enough to make Jake flinch. The room buzzed, whispers rippling through the crowd. Kate, Sophie's best friend, stood, arms crossed, her glare fixed on Ellen. You're unbelievable, she spat. She's married, and you're shopping her around like she's for sale. Sophie turned to her parents, her voice trembling but rising. Mom, Dad, did you pay him? She pointed at Jake, her words heavy with dread. Thomas set his phone down, his face blank as ever. A few gifts, he said, shrugging. A weekend suite. It's not illegal. Jake shifted, his cool slipping. I thought it was love, he muttered, glancing at Sophie. She whipped around, eyes blazing. Love? You thought I'd leave my husband for your tan? And a smile. Nick couldn't help it. A bitter laugh escaped, echoing in the tense air. Guess he's not as smart as you thought, he said to Ellen. Sophie turned back to him, stepping closer, her voice desperate. I didn't know Nick. I swear I didn't sleep with him. I wouldn't. But Nick's jaw tightened. You didn't stop it, he repeated, softer but colder. You let them decide who you should be with. The room erupted, voices overlapping. Ellen spun on Kate, snapping, stay out of this. Thomas tried to calm things, hands raised. Everyone relax. It's not what it looks like. But Nick stepped forward, his voice slicing through. It's exactly what it looks like. You try to sell my wife to some rich kid because you never liked me. Sophie sobbed, shaking her head. I didn't mean to, she whispered, but Nick just looked at her, the weight of her choices sinking in. Then Kate's phone buzzed, loud in the chaos. She glanced at it, her eyes widening, and passed it to Nick. A screenshot from a group chat, forwarded from a friend in Palm Springs. Jake's words glowed on the screen. Her parents guaranteed she's mine. Nick's out of the picture. Nick's blood ran cold. He held up the phone, showing the room. Guaranteed, huh? Sophie's jaw dropped, her gaze locking on Ellen. What does this mean? She demanded, her voice cracking. Ellen tilted her head, unfazed. We encouraged him a little, she said like it was nothing. A gift, a dinner. He misunderstood. Sophie's hands clenched. You promised him I'd leave Nick? Ellen shrugged, actually shrugged. We wanted what's best for you, sweetheart. Jake's a catch. The room exploded again, cousins shouting, Ryan shaking his head. Sophie crumpled into her chair, crying harder. Nick stepped back, letting the chaos unfold. He'd done his part, laid the truth bare. But the fallout wasn't over. By morning, Kate had shared the screenshot on X, and the story went viral. Hashtags like hashtag Palm Springs plot trended, strangers dissecting Thomas and Ellen's scheme. Ellen's wedding planning business tanked, clients canceling left and right. Thomas was quietly dropped from a corporate board, an email citing personal conduct. Jake's smug posts backfired. His business deals dried up, and he deleted his accounts, vanishing from the spotlight. Sophie showed up at Nick's house 2 days later, her eyes red, her voice small. I didn't betray you, she said, standing on the porch. I was stupid, but I didn't know their plan. Nick leaned against the doorframe, his heart heavy but resolute. You didn't fight for us, Sophie. You let them steer you away. Her tears fell, but he didn't move. I need time, he said, and she nodded, walking away into the dusk. Nick shut the door, the house quiet again. The truth was out, but it didn't feel like a win. It felt like a wound, raw, and open, with no easy way to heal. Nick stood in the Santa Barbara wedding venue, the same one where he and Sophie had danced under a sky of stars just 6 weeks ago. Tonight, the space felt different, lighter, like the air had been scrubbed clean. The wooden beams were draped with string lights, but instead of wedding vows, the room echoed with laughter, clinking glasses, and the thump of a playlist Nick had thrown together. No Sophie, no Thomas, no Ellen, no Jakey. Just the people who'd stood by him through the storm. Ryan, Kate, his cousins Mia and Lucas, his buddy Alex from work, and even his mom, fussing over a tray of sliders. At 28, Nick wasn't sure he'd ever feel whole again after the betrayal. But tonight, surrounded by this small, loyal crowd of 20, he felt something close to it. The tables were simple. Folding chairs, paper plates, a spread of pizza, wings, and a chocolate cake Kate had insisted on bringing. The smell of melted cheese and coffee filled the air, grounding Nick in the moment. Kate was the first to arrive, wrapping him in a hug that said more than words could. "You look good, Nick," she said, her eyes scanning his face. "Better than I expected." He smiled, a real one, not the tight-lipped mask he'd worn for weeks. "Feel better," he replied, and he meant it. Ryan clapped him on the shoulder next, handing him a cold beer. "Proud of you, man," he said, his voice low. "Takes guts to burn it all down and walk away." Nick popped the cap, the fizz a small victory. "Didn't feel like guts," he admitted. "Felt like surviving." More friends trickled in. Lucas and Mia, who'd been at the wedding and the explosive reveal, grinning like they were proud to see him standing tall. Alex, who'd texted daily to check in. His mom, who squeezed his arm and whispered, "You're stronger than you know." They ate, laughed, and swapped stories, the noise wrapping Nick like a warm blanket. Kate regaled the group with how she'd ripped into Ellen at the venue, earning cheers. Ryan bragged about his detective work in Palm Springs, calling himself the family spy, which got a round of laughs. For the first time in weeks, Nick relaxed, leaning back in his chair, the beer bottle cool against his palm. This wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was his, and it was enough. After a while, Nick stood, tapping his bottle with a spoon. The room quieted, all eyes on him. He took a deep breath, his voice steady. "Thanks for coming," he said. "You all know the last couple months have been a lot. The wedding, the trip, the truth. You saw the mess, good, bad, ugly, and you're still here. That means something." Nods rippled through the crowd, a few smiles. "I thought losing Sophie was the end of me," he went on, like I'd failed at the one thing I wanted. "But I figured out, sometimes a broken vow is a blessing in disguise. So here's to starting over." He raised his bottle, and they cheered, lifting their drinks in a messy, joyful toast. The night rolled on. Cake was cut, the music got louder, and Lucas dragged Nick onto the makeshift dance floor, laughing when Nick tripped over his own feet. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Later, Nick stepped outside for air, leaning against the railing where he and Sophie had stood on their wedding night, staring at the stars. The memories stung for a second, her white dress, her whispered promises, but then it faded, like a bruise healing. He didn't need her anymore. He'd spent weeks replaying the betrayal. Sophie's laugh with Jake, Ellen's smug grin, Thomas's cold indifference. But tonight, he wasn't angry. He was awake, like he'd finally opened his eyes after a long, dark dream. Kate joined him, hands in her pockets. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft against the night. Nick nodded, looking out at the dark. "Yeah, better than okay." She smiled, hesitating before adding, "Sophie's been asking about you. Called me yesterday, wanted to know if you'd softened up." Nick shrugged, the weight of her name lighter than it used to be. "Doesn't matter. I'm done looking back." She bumped his shoulder. "That's my guy." They stood in comfortable silence, the party's noise drifting out, laughter, clinking plates, a bad rendition of a pop song. When Nick went back inside, the group was still at it, Ryan and Alex arguing over the last slice of pizza, Mia snapping photos. Nick grabbed a piece of cake, sat with them, and let himself laugh, the sound foreign but welcome. The fallout from that night at the venue had hit hard and fast. Sophie had moved out, packing a bag and leaving without a fight. Thomas and Ellen tried to spin it, telling relatives it was mutual, but their story crumbled when Jake's ex-posts, boasting about Sophie being his, went viral. The backlash was swift. Ellen's wedding business lost clients. Thomas was ousted from his board seat. Jake vanished, his deal's gone. Sophie texted Nick 2 weeks ago. Can we talk? He'd let her come by, listen to her apologies, but her words, I didn't know, I was stupid, couldn't erase her inaction. You didn't fight for us, he'd told her, and she'd left, tears streaming. Now, under the Santa Barbara stars, Nick felt free, not just from Sophie, but from the weight of their lies. This was his ending, not the one he dreamed of, but better. He was whole, surrounded by people who chose him, and that was worth celebrating.